The stadium lights burned against the dark Rhode Island sky like pillars of fire, casting long shadows across the infield dirt where dreams had just turned to dust. The scoreboard read 8-7, Chicago, over Cumberland, and the Little League World Series run had ended in the space of a single strike. Parents in the bleachers sat frozen, clutching programs and each other, their faces wet not just from the August humidity but from watching their sons' shoulders sag under the unbearable weight of loss. The boys walked in silence toward the dugout, cleats dragging, gloves hanging limp at their sides, every step echoing the finality of it all. Then Coach David Belila, cap in hand and eyes steady, called out in a voice that cut through the heavy air, "Boys, come in close, let's talk to God before we go." They gathered on the edge of the outfield grass, 13 boys in dirt-streaked uniforms forming a circle under the floodlights that seemed suddenly brighter, more watchful. The crowd, which moments before had been a roar of disappointment, fell into a cathedral silence as the team knelt together, the wet grass soaking through their pants. Belila knelt with them, his weathered hands resting on the shoulders of the players closest to him, and he began to pray not for a miracle reversal, not for the game to be replayed, but for something deeper. His voice was soft but clear, carrying across the field to where ESPN cameras had stayed rolling, capturing what no one yet knew would become a moment that would travel far beyond South Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Behind the dugout, his wife Nancy watched with tears streaming down her face, knowing this was who her husband had always been, a man who brought God to the diamond. David Belila had grown up in a small Rhode Island parish where faith wasn't performed, was woven quietly into the fabric of daily life, present in every handshake, every shared meal, every word of encouragement. His father, Bill Belila, a legendary hockey coach at Mount St. Charles Academy, had taught him that sports were never just about the scoreboard. They were about forging character in the crucible of competition and disappointment. As a boy, David had watched his father console losing teams with the same tenderness others reserved only for winners, and he'd learned that the truest measure of a coach was not the trophies on the shelf, but the men his players became. When David began coaching Little League years later, he carried that lesson with him like a sacred trust, believing that every practice, every game, every moment on the field was an opportunity to shape not just athletes, but souls. To him, the baseball diamond was holy ground, a place where boys learned about courage, humility, and grace under pressure. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The 2014 season had been a journey of faith in more ways than one. Nancy, David's wife of 19 years and the bedrock of their family, had been diagnosed with colon cancer that spring, and the shadow of her illness hung over everything. She refused to be pitied, refused to let her diagnosis define her, and instead, she'd poured all her energy into supporting their youngest son, John's dream of reaching the Little League World Series. Just as his older brother James had done 3 years earlier, David had wanted to step away from coaching that season, to be home with Nancy, to hold her hand through the treatments and the terrible waiting. But she wouldn't hear of it. She wanted John to have this, wanted the team to have David, so he'd thrown himself into coaching with a desperation born of love, spending long summer evenings at the field while Nancy sat in the stands wrapped in a blanket despite the heat, cheering until her voice gave out. The team had responded with a ferocity that surprised everyone, winning game after game, district after district, until suddenly they were packing buses for Williamsport, and the whole town of Cumberland was painting signs and hanging banners. Every victory felt like a small miracle, a reprieve from the harsh reality waiting at home. And David prayed constantly before games, during games, in the quiet moments when the boys weren't watching, that God would give them all the strength to endure whatever came next. The Cumberland Americans had fought their way through the tournament with a grit that made commentators sit up and take notice. They were undersized, outmatched on paper, but they played with hearts too big for their 12-year-old bodies, diving for grounders, stretching singles into doubles, never backing down from teams with better records and bigger reputations. David coached them not with fury, but with love, pulling pitches with gentle words instead of harsh criticism, celebrating effort over outcomes, teaching them that how they treated each other mattered more than any trophy. In the semi-final game against Jackie Robinson West from Chicago, they'd battled back from deficits twice, refusing to quit even when the odds turned against them. And the game had come down to the final at-bat with the tying run on base. The crowd had been on its feet, New England holding its breath, and when the last strike was called, when the umpire's fist punched the air and the dream shattered, the silence that followed was deafening. David had felt his chest tighten. Not from the loss, but from knowing this was the last time he'd coach this particular group of boys. This team that had become something like a second family during the hardest summer of his life, as the boys knelt in the grass, heads bowed and shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. David Balilah closed his eyes and spoke the words that had been forming in his heart all season. "God, thank you for these boys," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "for their courage, their friendship, and their hearts that never quit even when the world said they should." He paused, gathering himself, feeling the weight of the moment, not just for his team, but for all the parents watching. All the coaches who'd forgotten what youth sports were supposed to be about. Help them remember that what matters isn't the score on that board over their writs, how they carry each other, how they lift each other up when someone falls, how they choose kindness over cruelty and humility over arrogance. The words flowed from somewhere deeper than strategy or coaching philosophy. They came from the place where faith and fatherhood intersected, where he understood that his job wasn't to make champions, but to make men, let them know they are loved by us, by their families, by their town, and by you. God, win or lose, strike out or home run, always. When he finished, the boys stayed kneeled for a long moment. The silence broken only by sniffles and the distant sound of the Chicago team celebrating. Then David opened his eyes, looked at each face in that circle, and said what his father had taught him to say in moments like these: "You're all winners, every single one of you." His voice grew stronger, more certain, as he spoke. "The only reason I'll be sad tonight is if I never get to coach you again, because you've given me something I'll carry forever." He told them about pride, about how they'd made Cumberland jump with excitement, how they'd made Rhode Island believe, how they'd shown the whole country on ESPN what it looked like to play the game with honor and heart. It wasn't rehearsed. He'd never planned this speech, never written notes or practiced lines, but the words tumbled out with the force of pure love. A father's love for his sons, a coach's love for his players, a believer's love for the divine mystery that brings people together for seasons like this. "You're not just my team," he said, tears now streaming down his own face. "You're my boys, and I'm going to love you forever." The ESPN cameras caught every second, the microphone that David had agreed to wear, thinking he'd never say anything he'd regret, had stayed live, broadcasting his prayer and his words to millions of viewers across America, who'd been watching just another baseball game and instead witnessed something transcendent. By the time the team finally broke their huddle and walked off the field with heads held high, not in victory but in dignity, the video was already being shared, replayed, dissected by anchors and commentators who kept saying they'd never seen anything like it. One anchor wiped his eyes on camera and said, "That's what coaching is supposed to look like." Another called it the most important 4 minutes in Little League history. The clip played on SportsCenter between highlights of professional games where millionaires argued with umpires, and the contrast couldn't have been to hear, was a man who understood that the measure of a season wasn't the final score, but the character forged along the way. By the next morning, David Balilah woke to find his phone flooded with messages. The video had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times and was still climbing. ESPN was calling for interviews. The Today Show wanted him in studio. Newspapers across New England were writing feature stories. Parents from across America sent emails thanking him for reminding them what youth sports should be. Not pressure-filled crucibles where adults lived vicariously through children, but places where kids learned about resilience and friendship and grace. A soldier deployed in Afghanistan wrote to say the speech had given him hope after weeks of difficult patrols, that it reminded him why he was fighting for a country where coaches still taught boys to pray and to care more about each other than about winning. A grandmother in Florida sent a handwritten letter saying she'd played the video for her grandson, who'd just quit his baseball team after being yelled at by his coach, and the boy had decided to try again. None of this surprised Nancy, who sat beside David as he read the messages, her hand in his, and said simply, "That's just who you are. Honey, you pray through everything, even the seventh inning." When NBC flew David to New York for the Today Show 3 days later, he sat in the green room, feeling out of place in his simple polo and khakis, surrounded by makeup artists and producers who treated him like a celebrity. On air, Matt Lauer asked him if he'd known the cameras were still rolling, and David shook his head with a small, embarrassed smile. "I didn't plan any of it," he said honestly. "It came from the heart, from what my faith tells me about how we're supposed to treat each other, especially in defeat." He talked about coaching as a form of ministry, about how the baseball field was his pulpit, and his sermons were about showing boys that humility and gratitude and love were more powerful than any trophy they'd ever win. "Character is how you lose, not how you win," he said, and Lauer nodded, leaning forward, captivated. The interview went viral too, shared and reshared, and suddenly David Belila had become more than a little league coach. He'd become a symbol of what was still good and true in youth sports, a reminder that faith and fatherhood could coexist with competition. The boys themselves began to change in the weeks and months that followed. They started gathering to pray before games without being told, forming circles in outfields across Rhode Island, bowing their heads together before first pitch. They helped opponents up after hard slides at second base, offered words of encouragement to pitchers who were struggling, played with a kindness that made other teams' coaches shake their heads in wonder. One boy, a shortstop named Tyler, wrote "Play with heart" on the thumb of his glove in black marker, and soon half the team had similar messages on their equipment. Parents noticed the transformation not in batting averages or earned run averages, but in the way their sons treated siblings at home, in the way they responded to disappointment with resilience instead of tantrums. He made them believe that kindness could win, one mother told Guideposts magazine in an interview 6 months later. That's David's real legacy, not the speech, but what it did to these kids' souls. David's faith had always been simple, unadorned, rooted in the small Rhode Island parish, where he'd been baptized and married and where Nancy's funeral would eventually be held. He loved God, loved his family, loved his players, and loved the game of baseball in that order, and he saw no contradiction between them. When he wasn't coaching, he taught Sunday school to middle schoolers at Sacred Heart Church, often using baseball analogies to explain concepts like perseverance and forgiveness and redemption. Every strikeout's a second chance, he'd tell his class with a grin. Just like every sin you confess is another chance to start fresh. His students loved him because he never talked down to them, never pretended faith was easy or that doubt was weakness. He acknowledged the hard questions while pointing them toward the hope that sustained him through Nancy's illness and death. He believed the diamond was holy ground if you knew how to see it right, that those floodlights were just another kind of stained glass, and that the crack of the bat was sometimes indistinguishable from the sound of answered prayer. The years rolled on, as they always do, and the boys grew into young men who carried that August night with them like a compass. They went to high school and college, pursued different dreams, scattered across New England and beyond, but they stayed connected through that shared memory of kneeling in the grass while their coach prayed over them. When they returned to Cumberland for a 5-year reunion, now 17 and 18 years old, with driver's licenses and college applications and girlfriends, they surprised David by forming a circle on the same field where it had all happened, without being asked, without prompting. They bowed their heads, and one of them, Tyler, the shortstop who'd written on his glove, began to pray, thanking God for their coach, for that season they'd never forget, for the lessons that had shaped them more than any classroom or textbook ever could. David stood at the edge of that circle with tears streaming down his weathered face. watching the stadium lights flicker on as dusk settled over Rhode Island, illuminating faces no longer soft with boyhood but beginning to show the first hints of the men they were becoming. Nancy would have loved this, he thought. She would have loved seeing what these boys became. Today, David Belila still coaches in Cumberland. Though not Little League anymore, his youngest son has aged out. And David has moved on to coaching high school hockey at Mount St. Charles, following in his legendary father's footsteps. His hair is grayer now, his joints ache a little more after long practices. But his voice is the same steady mix of kindness and conviction that it's always been. He tells every new team, whether they're on skates or cleats, the same thing he told those Cumberland Americans on that August night in 2014: play hard, pray harder, and never forget who you are when the lights go out. Some of his players call it old-fashioned, others call it exactly what they need in a world that's forgotten how to slow down and kneel. Either way, David keeps showing up, keeps coaching with his whole heart, keeps believing that somewhere between the white lines of a field or the blue lines of a rink, grace is still at work, still shaping souls, still teaching boys about what matters most. The trophies collect dust on his shelf at home, but the lessons those endure, passed from one generation to the next, like prayers whispered under stadium lights that never really go dark. This account is based on verified reporting by ESPN, NBC's Today Show, CBS News, Sports Illustrated, and Guideposts magazine, which documented Coach David Belila's viral post-game moment with his Cumberland American Little League team following their elimination from the 2014 Little League World Series in South Williamsport, Pennsylvania. His spontaneous words of encouragement became a national symbol of what youth sports can be at their best. Not about winning at all costs, but about building character, fostering love, and teaching young people that how they treat each other matters more than any scoreboard. While Coach Belila's message resonated with viewers of all backgrounds, his faith-centered approach to coaching and his belief that the diamond could be a place of ministry inspired countless parents and coaches to reconsider their own priorities. The speech has been viewed millions of times and remains one of the most shared moments in Little League history.